He thought he was just saving a dog from the snow. But when the retired colonel cut off the strange electronic bracelet from its leg, everything changed. An hour later, black SUVs surrounded his home, and what they were after would uncover a secret buried deep in the mountains. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which country you're watching from. The wind came off the mountain like a living thing that night, roaring through the pines with a force that made the wooden walls of the cabin groan. Snow fell in hard, dry sheets, sweeping across the valley in ghostly spirals. It was a night when even the deer took shelter, when the whole world seemed to huddle down and hold its breath. In the middle of that white wilderness, one house alone still showed a flicker of light through its frosted windows. Inside, Colonel Andrew Kyle sat at his kitchen table with a chipped mug of black coffee and the steady ticking of a wall clock that marked time as stubbornly as a soldier counting down the minutes of a watch. The man had the broad, square shoulders of someone who had spent a lifetime under weight, body armor, command, and grief. His hair, once a deep brown, had thinned to silver at the temples, and his eyes, pale blue like winter water, had learned the discipline of hiding what they saw. He had been retired for nearly 5 years now. The medals he once wore were boxed away in a drawer he hadn't opened since his wife's funeral. He had built this cabin himself, plank by plank, high enough in the Rockies that the nearest neighbor was a mile down the slope. Here, silence was not something to endure. It was a wall between him and the world he no longer trusted. Outside, the generator coughed, sputtered, and went silent. Andrew sighed, pushing himself up with the weary precision of habit. The heater was still running on residual power, but not for long. He put on his heavy coat, grabbed the flashlight that hung by the door, and stepped outside. The cold hit him instantly, burning his lungs, the kind of cold that stripped sound from the air. He trudged toward the shed where the generator sat behind a lean-to of tin and wood, his boots crunching on the crusted snow. The beam of his flashlight wavered in the white blur, catching brief glimpses of the surrounding trees. Everything seemed still, the kind of stillness that carried its own warning. He could feel it in his bones. Something was off about the night. He bent to check the fuel line and the choke, mechanical motions that had become routine. That was when he heard it, a sound faint and uneven, half swallowed by the wind. He froze, holding his breath. It wasn't the creak of trees or the shifting of snow. It was long, thin, broken by gasps. At first it sounded like the wail of the storm itself, but then it came again, closer this time. A cry, a whimper carried across the gale. It was not human, but not quite animal either. The sound raised the hair on the back of his neck. He turned off the flashlight and listened harder, every instinct he had sharpened from years in war zones snapping awake. The cry came again, to the east, just beyond the tree line near the old logging road. Andrew hesitated only a moment. He knew better than to wander into a storm. But something in that sound carried the kind of suffering he had heard too many times before. He went back into the cabin, took the rifle from its mount by the door, slung it over his shoulder, and returned to the night. The snow bit into his face as he made his way downhill. The world outside the beam of his flashlight was an ocean of white and shadow. He could feel the cold seep through the seams of his gloves, but he kept going, guided by that faint, desperate sound. It drew him down the slope and through a cluster of dead aspens, until, at last, the light caught something unnatural in the snow. A glint of metal, then a shape that made him stop short. At first he thought it was a pile of debris, but then it moved. He stepped closer, heart pounding, and the light revealed a dog. A large German shepherd lay on its side, chest heaving weakly. Thick ropes stretched from its legs to iron stakes, driven deep into the frozen ground, binding it in a cruel spread. Its fur was matted with ice and blood. Around one hind leg was a metallic device, a band of steel with a small red light that pulsed like a heartbeat. The animal's eyes rolled toward him, glassy with exhaustion, yet alive. The snow around its body was a field of trampled struggle, streaked with frozen crimson. Andrew knelt in the drift, scanning the scene like a battlefield. Whoever had done this had taken their time. The knots were tight, the stakes evenly placed, and the metal band on the dog's leg was more than a collar. It looked like equipment, something built by human hands. He reached forward, voice low, calm. "Easy there. I'm not going to hurt you." The words were habit, not hope. He edged closer, and the red light on the band suddenly flared bright. A thin crackle of electricity split the air, and the dog convulsed. Its body arched. A choked cry tore from its throat, and the stench of burned fur hit his nose. Andrew cursed and pulled back, shielding his face. The device was live-wired to deliver a shock on command. His breath came fast, pluming in the freezing air. Whoever left the animal here had done more than abandon it. They were testing it. He set down the flashlight, unslung the rifle, and reached for the knife on his belt. He traced the wires leading from the band. One ran beneath the snow toward the iron stakes. The whole setup was crude, but intentional, like a field restraint designed for experiments. He knelt again, ignoring the cold seeping through his pants, and began cutting at the rope. The dog whimpered but didn't fight him, as if instinct recognized something safe. Andrew worked quickly, every motion measured. He had dismantled bombs with less precision. When the last cord gave way, he leaned over the metal band. The casing was seamless, stainless steel, with a small rectangular port sealed by frost. He dug out a screwdriver from his coat and pried at the seam until it snapped open. Inside, a circuit board blinked weakly, and etched across the inner plate was a logo. North Peak RD, Biocontrol Unit R7 prototype. He stared at it, his breath fogging the metal. The name brought a chill deeper than the snow. He remembered North Peak. 10 years earlier, the company had been linked to classified defense contracts projects involving behavioral modification, neural mapping, and pain suppression. Officially, the work was terminated after congressional hearings. Unofficially, rumors said some of it went underground. He snapped the casing shut and shoved it into his pocket. The dog's breathing had slowed. Andrew slid his arms beneath the limp body, grunting with the weight. The animal was big, close to 90 pounds, but felt lighter from starvation. He lifted it against his chest and began the slow climb back to the cabin. The wind pushed at his back, howling like a warning, but he didn't stop. Each step was deliberate, his boots sinking deep into the snow. He could feel the animal's heart fluttering weakly against his ribs, its breath shallow, rasping. When he reached the porch, he shouldered open the door and stumbled inside. The warmth hit them both like a wave. He set the dog down on a rug near the fireplace, stripped off his gloves, and went for the medical kit he still kept from his service days. The room filled with the faint hiss of antiseptic and the crackle of fire. Andrew cleaned the wounds as best he could, shallow cuts on the legs, deeper ones along the belly where the ropes had bitten into flesh. The band's contact points had left scorched circles on the fur. The smell of infection lingered. He wrapped the wounds, started a slow IV drip with saline from the kit, and covered the animal with a wool blanket. Through it all, the dog barely stirred, only opening its eyes once when Andrew wiped the blood from its muzzle. There was no aggression there, only exhaustion, a kind of silent question he had seen before in dying soldiers. He sat back on his heels, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. "You're going to make it," he murmured, unsure who he was convincing. "You made it this far." The dog's eyes fluttered shut, its body relaxing into the warmth. For the first time in months, Andrew felt something stir in his chest that wasn't bitterness. It was small, fragile, like a spark in the ashes of a long-dead fire. He didn't know why he cared so much already, but he did. He reached out and rested a calloused hand on the animal's shoulder. "You'll need a name," he said softly. "You came out of the storm, out of the silence. Echo. That's what you'll be." Hours passed. The storm outside grew worse, hammering at the windows. But inside, the cabin glowed with the steady pulse of firelight. Andrew sat in his chair, watching the rise and fall of Echo's breathing. He found himself studying the lines of the animal's body, the muscles that spoke of breeding and training, the scars that spoke of cruelty. Whoever had owned him hadn't just trained him. They had tried to erase him. Andrew thought of the inscription on the device again, of the name North Peak, and a part of him, the soldier part, began to plan. He would call in a few favors, get some answers, find out whether this was the work of amateurs or something bigger. Sometime near dawn, the storm began to break. The first gray light of morning seeped through the frost-caked windows, casting the cabin in silver. Echo stirred, lifting his head weakly, his eyes meeting Andrew's. For a long moment, they simply regarded each other. Two creatures that had seen too much pain to trust easily. Then the dog laid his head back down, sighing softly. Andrew smiled faintly. "You're safe now," he said. Outside, the mountains lay buried beneath a new layer of snow, smooth and white as if the world had decided to start over. But the world rarely starts over. At the edge of the forest, half hidden by a drift, a pair of tire tracks cut through the fresh powder, leading away from the main road. A black SUV idled quietly at a distance, its headlights off. Through the windshield, a man watched the small cabin on the ridge. His gloved hands rested on the steering wheel, unmoving. When he saw the faint curl of smoke rise from the chimney, he reached for the radio clipped to his coat. "Visual confirmed," he said into the static. "Unit R7 is alive. Proceed to next phase." The reply came through the speaker, short and cold. "Maintain distance. Do not engage." The SUV rolled forward, its tires whispering over the snow, and disappeared among the trees. Inside the cabin, Andrew poured another cup of coffee and glanced once more at the dog by the fire. He didn't know yet that he had just stepped back into the kind of war he thought he had left behind, or that the animal sleeping in his home was more than a victim. He only knew the silence felt different now, less like solitude, more like the pause before something begins again. As the wind eased and the first sun touched the mountain peaks, the colonel who had once commanded men to survive impossible battles sat quietly beside a creature that had survived its own. Somewhere beneath the snow outside, unseen wires still pulsed with power, waiting for the signal that would wake what the world believed buried. And in that fragile peace between storms, a man and a dog, both scarred by obedience and loss, drew their first breath of a new fight neither had yet imagined. Morning came slow and colorless over the mountains, turning the snow into a dim, endless field of pale glass. Andrew woke to the sound of the wind slipping along the eaves and the soft creak of the wood stove cooling down. His breath misted faintly in the cold air. For a moment he forgot where he was, until his eyes fell on the shape by the hearth. The German shepherd stretched on the rug, chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Echo. The dog was alive. That single fact steadied something inside him. He poured water from the kettle into a tin mug, drank it without sugar, and watched the pale steam curl upward like a fading thought. Outside, the forest was quiet. Inside, he could feel the strange weight of company for the first time in years. Echo stirred, lifting his head when Andrew approached. The animal's eyes were clearer now, the fever gone, though a kind of wary intelligence still lived behind them. When Andrew spoke, the dog didn't flinch. He simply watched, every muscle still. "You're not just trained," Andrew murmured. "You're conditioned." He crouched, examining the bandages. The burns were closing, but there was something about the scars. Clean, circular, deliberate. They looked almost surgical. He ran a hand along the animal's flank and felt the stiff outline of an old implant beneath the skin. Whoever had done this hadn't been a backyard experimenter. It was military, or worse. Private research with no oversight, no ethics. He straightened, went to the table, and retrieved the metal band he'd pried off the dog's leg. In daylight, it looked even more sinister. A seamless cuff of brushed steel, no wider than his thumb, with microports along one side and a tiny red diode that still flickered faintly, as though something deep inside refused to die. He turned it in his hand, tracing the etching. North Peak RD, Biocontrol Unit R7 prototype. The name haunted him. It belonged to a ghost from his service years, whispered between intelligence officers when new weapons were being tested and men were told not to ask questions. He remembered a briefing years ago about non-human behavioral enhancement. Everyone in that room had agreed it was a dead end. He took a picture of the device with the old field phone he kept for emergencies and sent it to John Hayson, one of the few people left who still answered his calls. Hayson had been a liaison between combat engineers and the research divisions during the wars. If anyone could trace the name, it was him. Hours passed before the signal reached through the mountains. When the phone finally buzzed, Andrew felt a flicker of anticipation. He lifted it to his ear, and Hayson's voice came through rough with static. "Jesus, Andy, where did you find that thing?" "In the snow," Andrew said, wrapped around a dog's leg. The rest of him was half frozen. Hayson swore softly. "That's not just a shock collar. It's a neural regulator. Prototype model from a closed project. R7. They were testing pain suppression linked to behavioral triggers. Shut down after a scandal about 3 years back. Officially, the labs were dismantled." "And unofficially?" "Unofficially," Hayson said. "Some of the gear went missing. We always suspected someone privatized the tech. What you've got in your hand shouldn't exist anymore." Andrew looked toward the fireplace, where Echo now slept again, twitching faintly in dreams. "Then someone brought it back. He's been trained. Commands, formation stance, the whole thing. He reacts to military cues." "Andy," Hayson said quietly. "If that collar was active, it had a transmitter, a locator. You might not be alone out there." The line crackled, then went dead. Andrew stood motionless for a long time, listening to the silence of the cabin. The fire popped, a single sharp sound like a gunshot, and Echo's head lifted immediately, ears pricked. The reaction was too clean, too disciplined. That was when Andrew knew Hayson was right. He spent the next hour checking the windows. The snow had stopped falling, but the sky was iron gray, heavy with more to come. Through the binoculars he kept by the door, he scanned the slope leading down to the road. Nothing. Still, he felt it. The faint itch between the shoulder blades that meant he was being watched. He moved outside under the pretext of chopping wood, letting his eyes trace the tree line. There, nearly a quarter-mile down the old logging track, a dark shape gleamed under a coat of ice. A vehicle, half buried, engine cold. Whoever had been sitting there had left recently. When he came back in, Echo was standing by the door, tail stiff, gaze fixed on the same direction. Andrew set the axe aside and knelt, rubbing the dog's neck. "You feel it too, don't you?" The animal gave a low growl, deep and distant, the kind that came from memory rather than threat. Andrew took it as confirmation. That night, he prepared. He cleaned the rifle, checked the ammunition, laid out tripwires and small perimeter alarms, relics from the war he had hoped never to use again. He moved through the tasks with a calm efficiency that both comforted and disturbed him. It felt too natural, like slipping back into an old uniform that still fit too well. By dusk, the temperature dropped sharply. The world turned blue and still. Echo refused to eat much, though he stayed close, following Andrew from room to room. The veteran finally sat in the chair by the window, listening to the wood crackle, when headlights suddenly flickered across the trees. He turned off the lamp. The vehicle crawled up the road, black and sleek, stopping just beyond the porch. The engine idled. Snow drifted through the headlights like ash. Then a door opened, and a man stepped out. He wore a dark wool coat and gloves, his hair cut short, his movements deliberate. When he reached the steps, he smiled, a polished, empty smile that never reached his eyes. "Colonel Kyle," he said, voice smooth. "My name is Victor Hale. I represent North Peak Systems. You've come into possession of something that belongs to us." Andrew didn't move. He stood in the doorway, the rifle resting against his leg. "You're trespassing." Hale glanced past him, toward the glow of the fire. "We only want what's ours. The unit you found, it's unstable. Dangerous, in fact. Better to let us remove it before anyone gets hurt." "The dog?" Andrew asked. "You mean the animal you strapped a live current to and left to die in the snow?" Hale's expression didn't change. "We regret the necessity of field testing. You, of all people, understand research requires sacrifice." Andrew's voice went low. "I understand cruelty when I see it." A pause stretched between them. Snow ticked softly against the steps. Finally, Hale nodded once. "You're making a mistake, Colonel. There are contracts in place. Levels. You can't begin to—" Andrew shut the door in his face. For a few seconds, there was only silence. Then the slow crunch of boots retreating through the snow. The engine started, faded into the distance. Andrew waited, counting breaths, before he turned back to Echo. The dog stood rigid, gaze fixed on the window. Andrew whispered, "They'll be back." Echo's ears twitched, as if he understood. Later that night, the alarms went off, a faint metallic click outside, then another. Andrew was out of bed in seconds, moving with the fluid certainty of a man who had slept beside danger for years. He took the rifle, motioned the dog to stay low, and eased the door open. The cold hit him like a wall. Down by the woodpile, two figures in black moved through the snow, rifles slung, visors reflecting the moonlight. Professional. No lights, no noise. They thought the cabin was dark. He circled around the side, keeping to the shadows. Echo followed soundlessly, his paws leaving barely a trace. The first intruder reached the porch, bent to plant something by the door. A charge, maybe. Andrew stepped out from behind the shed and fired once. The man dropped without a sound. The second whirled, weapon rising, but Echo was already on him. The dog hit with a weight that drove the man backward into the snow. There was a muffled shout, a struggle, and then silence again. When it was over, Andrew stood breathing hard, the rifle still steady. The first man was unconscious but alive. The second was gone into the trees. Andrew searched the body he had downed. No ID, just a steel tag around the neck stamped with a familiar logo, North Peak RD. He pocketed it, his mind working coldly. They had come fast, too fast for a simple retrieval mission. That meant there was a command center somewhere near, perhaps within the mountains themselves. He dragged the body into the shed, bound his hands, and left him there in the freezing dark. Inside, the cabin smelled of gunpowder and pine smoke. Echo stood in the corner, chest heaving. Andrew knelt beside him, resting a hand on the dog's fur. "Good work," he said quietly. The animal's eyes met his, dark and unreadable. There was no joy in the praise, only understanding. He cleaned the rifle again at the table, every motion slow and deliberate. On the wood lay the collar, the tag, and a small data chip he had pried from the metal cuff earlier that day. Under a magnifier, he saw an etched pattern that looked like coordinates. He fed it into the old laptop he used for maps. The screen blinked, then displayed a set of numbers, a point deep within the mountains, far from any known road. Next to it, a label. Storage Facility R7. He stared at the coordinates until the fire burned down to embers. It was clear now. The dog had been part of something ongoing, not a relic of a dead project, but a piece of a living one. Somewhere in those hills, North Peak still operated. He thought of the cells he'd seen overseas, of secret warehouses where things were done under the banner of progress. He felt the old anger rise, not the rage of youth, but the quiet, unyielding kind that came when conscience finally outweighed obedience. By dawn, he had made his decision. He packed a rucksack with rations, medical supplies, and ammunition. From a locker, he took the sidearm he hadn't touched in years, cleaned it, oiled it, and slid it into its holster. Echo watched the whole time, tail low but steady. "We're going on a walk," Andrew said, fastening the straps. "Long one." The dog padded to the door. Ready. He stepped out into the cold. The world was silent again, the snow unbroken except for the fresh track of tires leading away down the road. He followed it with his eyes until it disappeared among the trees, then turned toward the ridge where the coordinates pointed. The sun rose behind him, staining the mountains in pale gold. For the first time in years, he felt something close to purpose. Not revenge, not duty, just the need to end what should have never begun. He looked once more at the cabin, the smoke curling from its chimney, then down at the dog beside him. "Come on, Echo," he said. "Let's finish this." Together, they moved into the trees, leaving the house behind. In the distance, the valley held its breath. Snow began to fall again, light and fine, covering their footprints as they went, erasing the last trace of where they had been, and leading them toward the shadowed heart of the mountains, where the name R7 waited, still alive, still humming beneath the ice. The climb began before sunrise, when the sky was still a bruised shade of indigo, and the forest slept beneath its crust of frost. The world had grown silent again, but not with peace. More like the silence of a held breath before an explosion. Andrew moved through the snow in steady rhythm, each step deliberate, his body remembering the discipline of long marches, even though his years had dulled his speed. The rucksack dug into his shoulders, but he didn't feel the pain. It was an old burden, the weight of duty, and it fit him too well. Beside him, Echo trotted without a sound, head low, eyes scanning the tree line. Every few steps the dog paused, nostrils flaring, listening to something Andrew could not hear. They were an unlikely pair, a broken soldier and a creature built to obey, both scarred by the same kind of masters. The coordinates from the data chip led deeper into the range, beyond where most hikers dared to go. The path wound along an abandoned mining road, half swallowed by snow and time, until it ended in a clearing filled with the remains of concrete bunkers and rusted fuel drums. It looked like a graveyard of forgotten wars, but when Andrew brushed the snow from one of the steel doors, he saw the faint glint of a modern lock pad, still active and pulsing faintly red beneath the frost. The place wasn't dead. It was sleeping. He crouched and studied the mechanism, a military-grade keypad with a fingerprint scanner added later private modification. Someone had repurposed the bunker. He traced the edges, found the wiring, and smiled without humor. They hadn't even changed the old access panel beneath the frame. He pried it open and crossed 2 wires with a piece of copper torn from his toolkit. Sparks flared, the lock clicked, and the door gave a reluctant sigh as it opened. A wave of stale air rolled out, thick with the smell of oil and disinfectant. Echo whined softly. "Yeah," Andrew muttered. "Me too." He switched on his flashlight and stepped inside. The tunnel descended sharply, lined with corroded pipes and tangled cables. Somewhere far below, a generator hummed, steady and alive. The light fell across faded warning signs. Authorized personnel only. Biosecurity clearance required. The deeper they went, the newer the construction became. The walls shifted from rust-streaked steel to smooth composite panels, the kind used in modern research facilities. Andrew's breath ghosted in front of him. He counted his steps without realizing it, a soldier's reflex. 50, 70, 100 yards. Then the passage opened into a wide chamber filled with cages. At first, the sight didn't register. His mind refused to process the scale. Rows upon rows of containment units stretched into the darkness, each separated by narrow aisles and marked with a digital panel glowing faintly blue. The air was thick with the stench of ammonia and something sharper fear. Some of the cages were empty, others weren't. Dogs, dozens of them, of different breeds and sizes, some awake and trembling, others lying still. Everyone wore a metal band on the leg identical to the one Andrew had taken from Echo. When the beam of his flashlight passed over them, a few stirred weakly. He could see the burns, the shaved patches on their heads, the sutures where metal met flesh. His stomach turned. Echo growled low, ears flattened, tail stiff as a rod. "Easy," Andrew whispered, though his own voice shook. "We'll get them out." He crossed the room, scanning for a control terminal. Near the far wall stood a bank of computers, their screens flickering with data. Graphs, neural activity maps, strings of identification codes. The header on one display read R7 Behavioral Compliance Analysis. He leaned closer. Each file listed metrics, pain thresholds, obedience indexes, failure rates. Then he saw a name. Prototype 7B. Status. Terminated. He froze. That was Echo's serial mark. They had declared him dead. He looked down at the dog, who was watching him silently, as if sensing the recognition. "You were supposed to die out there," Andrew said quietly, "and they came to make sure you did." His hand clenched around the edge of the console. Rage settled in him like iron, cold and steady. A noise behind him made him turn. A door at the far end of the lab slid open, and light poured through. Several figures entered, their shadows stretching long across the floor. In the lead was Victor Hale. He looked exactly as he had the night before, impeccable, calm, as if the freezing hike through the wilderness had been a short stroll. "Colonel Kyle," he said, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "I should have known you wouldn't stay in your cabin." Andrew lifted the rifle, but Hale only smiled. "You don't need that. You've already seen what happens when violence solves nothing." He gestured toward the cages. "They're remarkable, aren't they? Perfect loyalty, perfect endurance. They don't question orders. They don't hesitate. They don't bleed the way we do. You call this loyalty?" Andrew's voice was rough. "You tortured them. You broke them down like machines." Hale's expression didn't flicker. "We refined them. The R7 program was meant to save lives, human lives. Imagine a battlefield where no soldiers die, where pain and fear are erased from the equation. These animals carry our will. They fight, so our sons don't have to." Andrew took a step forward. "My son died because of men who talked just like you." The memory cut sharp, but he welcomed it. War doesn't stop when you take the blood out of it. It just finds new ways to kill. Hale sighed, as though speaking to a stubborn student. "You're still clinging to an obsolete morality. The world moves on, Colonel. Evolution favors utility." He nodded toward the doorway, and from the shadows emerged a massive man in tactical armor, scar bisecting his cheek. The insignia on his shoulder read, K. Briggs. He carried a rifle loosely in one hand, a shock baton in the other. "This is your last chance," Hale said. "Step aside and leave the facility. The prototype will be retrieved, and you can go back to your quiet little exile." Andrew's answer was the click of the rifle's safety disengaging. "Not today." Briggs moved first. The flash of metal was almost too fast to follow. Andrew dove behind a console as bullets tore through the air, shattering glass and spraying sparks. Echo lunged, snarling, teeth flashing white. The sound of struggle filled the chamber, a clash of men and animal and machinery. Andrew rolled, came up firing, his shots ricocheting off the steel walls. Briggs went down to one knee, cursing. Echo hit him from the side, jaws closing on his forearm. The man bellowed, swinging wildly, trying to shake the dog off. Andrew fired again, and Briggs crumpled, dragging Echo down with him. Smoke filled the room, thick and acrid. Hale retreated toward the corridor, shouting orders into a headset. Red alarms began to strobe overhead, bathing the cages in blood-colored light. Andrew seized the moment, running to the control station. The main interface still glowed. Containment protocol engaged. He typed commands with the speed of long-forgotten training, overriding security layers. Each click released another cell. One by one, the locks disengaged. Doors swung open. Confused, trembling animals stumbled out into the chaos. "Go!" Andrew yelled. "Run!" Echo limped toward him, fur streaked with blood, but eyes burning with life. When the last cage opened, Andrew turned to the generator control panel. The wiring layout came to him in an instant: redundant circuits, fuel feed lines, coolant vents. The entire place ran on a single power hub beneath the floor. If he overloaded it, the explosion would collapse the tunnels, sealing everything inside. He tore open a junction box, pulled two wires, and jammed a screwdriver between them. Sparks burst like stars. The alarms wailed louder. Hale's voice rang from the corridor. "You'll destroy evidence vital to national security. Do you have any idea what you're doing?" Andrew looked up from the console, his face lit by the flickering red light. "Yeah," he said. "Finishing the war you started." He grabbed Echo and ran. The corridor shook as the first blast tore through the lower levels. Flames erupted from the vents, sweeping up the walls. The temperature surged, steel warped and buckled. Behind them, the lab disintegrated into a storm of fire and metal. They reached the entrance tunnel just as a second explosion roared, throwing them forward into the snow outside. Andrew hit the ground hard. The breath punched out of him. The world spun, filled with sound and light. When he rolled onto his back, the night sky above the mountains burned orange. For a moment, he thought he heard screams from within the bunker, but the sound could have been anything. The wind, the echo of collapsing steel, ghosts. He pulled himself up on one elbow. Echo lay a few feet away, chest heaving, one paw twisted awkwardly. Andrew crawled to him, hands shaking, and pressed his forehead against the dog's. "You're okay," he whispered. "We're okay." The dog's eyes fluttered open, focused on him, and he felt the faint brush of a tongue against his wrist. Around them, snow began to fall again, soft and clean, covering the blackened ground. Dawn crept slowly over the mountains. By the time the smoke had thinned to gray wisps, the world was quiet again. The entrance to the facility was gone, buried under tons of ice and rock. Whatever remained of the R7 project lay entombed beneath it. Andrew sat on a boulder, one arm around Echo, watching the sun break the horizon. His body ached. His clothes were scorched and torn, but he felt lighter than he had in years. For the first time, the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt earned. They stayed there for a long time, until the cold began to creep in again. Then Andrew rose slowly, whistled for Echo, and started down the mountain. Neither looked back. The fire behind them had burned out, leaving only a faint column of steam curling into the brightening sky. Weeks later, the newspapers ran a small story on page 6. Unidentified explosion destroys private research site in northern Colorado. No survivors reported. Investigation pending. No one mentioned dogs or soldiers or a man named Victor Hale. The world moved on as it always did, burying its sins under bureaucracy and snow. Andrew settled in a small cabin near the base of the range, by a frozen lake, where the water glimmered like glass beneath the ice. He repaired the old boat that had been there when he arrived, fished a little, kept to himself. Echo healed slowly. The scars on his leg never fully faded, but he could run again. And he did, bounding across the drifts, barking into the wind like it was his first breath of life. Sometimes Andrew would stand by the shore and watch him, a faint smile tugging at his lips. The ache of memory still lingered, but it no longer ruled him. The nightmares had quieted. At night, when the fire burned low, he would look at the shadows flickering on the walls and think of the cages, the faces of those other animals now free somewhere out there. Maybe they'd found a home. Maybe they'd vanished into the wild. Either way, it was better than what had been waiting for them underground. One evening, as twilight settled over the lake, he sat on the porch with Echo at his feet. The air was still, heavy with the smell of pine and snowmelt. He thought about calling Hasten, about telling him everything, but decided against it. Some truths didn't need to be written in reports. They only needed to be buried deep enough that no one could dig them up again. He reached down, scratched the dog's ear, and said softly, "We made it out, partner. That's all that matters now." Echo lifted his head, eyes catching the last light of day. For a moment, the reflection in them looked almost human, a flicker of recognition, or maybe understanding. Andrew didn't question it. He just sat there, listening to the distant call of an owl and the slow breathing beside him. The mountains loomed dark against the stars, silent witnesses to another war ended in secret. Snow began to fall again, light as ash, covering the world in its quiet absolution. Somewhere beneath that endless white, the ruins of the North Peak facility still smoldered. The world above would never know what had been done there, nor who had stopped it. And that was fine. The past belonged to the dead, and the dead had earned their rest. Andrew took one last look at the sky, then rose, opened the door, and stepped inside. Echo followed, the sound of his claws soft on the wooden floor. The fire crackled back to life, throwing long, warm shadows across the walls. Outside, the wind shifted through the trees, carrying with it a faint, distant sound that might have been the echo of a howl, or perhaps only the mountains themselves exhaling at last. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are many more stories worth discovering. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too powerful to keep to yourself.